Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Rolka. Thank you for checking out my video. This is Community Questions 18. I apologize, I put 17 in the notification on the Community tab. But you get the idea. Community Questions 18. You ask questions, I offer you my answers, thoughts, and sometimes musings, as sometimes I indulge myself. I'm not going to indulge myself in talking a lot here. I'm going to dive into the questions, some juicy stuff today. Do stick around. It's chaptered, so if you want to scope out the subject matter that you are particularly interested in, you can peruse the questions in the timeline or up top in the description. In the description, you will also find ways to support my channel. They do include Patreon, where you can get MP3s of the stuff that I do on YouTube, like the warm-ups and all that kind of stuff. I deliver those as MP3s to my patrons, as well as my PDF worksheets. There's not a PDF for this one, but there are PDFs for the warm-ups and things like that. Do subscribe if you haven't yet. I appreciate it if you have. If you haven't yet, it really does help the channel, and I greatly appreciate it. Let's get to it. I sing a song in our set which sees me using a lot of power and upper register. The song breaks down in the middle to a quiet section, and this is where I struggle. My voice becomes weak and unable to carry the notes quietly, softly. I have to resort to using more power. Is this a known issue or just bad technique? Specifically, the song is Starlight by Muse, if you know it. I hope this question can add value to your already brilliant questions and answer videos. The brilliant questions, this individual is talking about you folks. As for the answers, well, I do the best I can. And I love questions, and I think this is a great question, and there's so many opportunities here to talk about things that I think are important to all of us, myself included, quite frankly. So the tune is Starlight by Muse. Love the tune. Beautiful, beautiful song. The breakdown that they are referring to, if I'm not mistaken, is about 1 minute and 48, like 1 minute 47, 1 minute 48 seconds into the song. And there's a lot of different ways to look at this. Now, one, you mentioned technique or technical kind of issues. And there's a few things that immediately come to mind. Now, I don't know your voice, but you could be being too heavy in general with your thyroarytenoid dominant singing voice. And while that might not mean it entirely prohibits you from going over the secondo passaggio and using your cricothyroid dominant singing voice, when you're trying to sing a softer section like this, those discrepancies in the way that you have grown accustomed to using vocal fold engagement as part of that sound could create issues. Now, there's a few other things that I think are outside the voice too that we can discuss. One, if you listen to the song, there is a dramatic change in texture. Now, yes, there is a subtle change to the way, and I don't know the person's name who sings it in Muse. I should have looked that up and I failed. I didn't do that. But at any rate, you can hear, and we're going to talk about this, there's a difference in the way that he sings it. But there's also a massive change in the production of the song. We must not be deceived by that. We must not be deceived by that, because the functional changes in his vocal delivery are not nearly so great as what happens to the production of the tune. It dramatically shifts. Now, when he's in that section, if you listen really carefully to the melody, and I'm really sorry, I can't play it for you here because of copyright stuff, and I just don't want to do that whole copyright thing. But what I can do is, that's the melody that gets sung there, and I can even sing it for you. Our hopes and expectations. You know, if I'm singing that full voice, balance of resonance, balance of the way that I use my voice, maintaining the flexibility of the vocal mechanism is perceived as power. So my secondo passaggio is right there on that F sharp. but I'm being as balanced as I possibly can, allowing my voice to shift up into my cricothyroid dominant singing voice and then come back down even just on that one pitch. But we work towards balance and overall resonance in the voice. If we're too heavy on all those notes below, and I should show you too, if we're too heavy on those notes that are below the secondo passaggio, it robs us of resonance, it robs us of that brilliance, and we will not be perceived of as having as much power. Now, it is true that when he does that melody in the breakdown, there is a slightly changed affectation to his voice. And there's two ways to look at this. One, there's an element of abduction or separation to the vocal fold. There's a tiny little bit of breathiness. Hopes and expectations. When we work towards having balance, we can also skew that balance when we want to and allow the vocal fold to separate a little bit so that we have a little bit of air seepage. But in general, when our technique is still developing in this practice, the tendency is to disengage too much, to allow this to separate too much, and also to disengage from our core body structure, our engagement, the flow of air. And then what happens is we get into this catastrophic cycle where the vocal fold starts to separate more and we get really tense and it can get intonation issues and all these other problems. So practical solutions here. Oh, one other thing, consonants. Notice the different way that he addresses consonants in the rest of the song. The actual quality of the phonation, the way that the vowels in the words sound in the fuller voiced sections, is largely the same, but his addressing of the consonants becomes more and more aggressive as he gets further into the tune. This has the tendency of separating out the phrasing a little bit more, makes it sound a little bit more aggressive, and this in turn gets interpreted as being more to the fore or a bit more aggressive to us. So while he's using his voice from a vowel standpoint functionally the same, the change in the consonants gives us the sensation that is more to the fore, more to the point, more aggressive in the way that it is being addressed. So that's a brilliant question. I really hope that helps. Practical practices for this kind of a thing. Work on balance. Right there in the range of the melody in question, and then work towards changing that. Find out how much disengagement, how much of that of abduction of the vocal fold is required to get the kind of softness and affectation that you're looking for in the delivery. And then practice that, use that. Again, the tendency is going to be to overdo it. Almost certainly way too much, in the exception of being like the most extreme circumstances where there's some affect, some reason why the lyrics require that level of disengagement, disconnect of the vocal fold. Is probably as much as I would comfortably use and still be able to phrase effectively, because when we separate the vocal fold like that, we're leaking air. That means that we're not going to be able to have as long of phrases. So you're going to have to plan for more breaths. Beyond that, that's a very small amount of separation. There's an ever so slight little seepage of air there. I can phrase fairly normally that way and be quite comfortable with it, and I'm not really going to feel much taxing on the vocal structures. I hope that helps. That was a brilliant question. Let's keep going. How long does it take to get the voice back into shape? I think I actually answered this in written format too. It depends on what you mean by back into shape, if it's performance practices or things like that. Generally speaking, I'm going to take this in the context of I've been sick and I've been really sick. So there's I've been sick, or for some reason my voice is particularly fatigued, or I have strained it in some way. After an appropriate vocal rest, particularly if you've strained it, depending on what you mean by ready or performance ready, 2 weeks, give or take. It might be a week, and after that, your audience might not notice a difference, but you might still feel a difference in the function. And then beyond that, you might be getting back to normal. If you have lost your voice for some reason, you've had laryngitis, you've had a terrible cold or flu, and you could not effectively speak. And actually, I talked about this in the live event, I think. It can take some time. I mean, the most recent experience I have had with that was a couple years ago, and I don't think most people noticed there was a problem with my voice after the first couple weeks of my recovery plan. But I didn't really feel normal for about 6 months. It took me quite some time before I felt like I was back on an even keel. But there's so many variables in this. Your performance practice, what you mean by ready, what it is that you are recovering from, all of those make a big difference. What would be some effective exercises to help a tenor expand his lower range? Quite simply, light and bright. So if I'm trying to be down here, which is really kind of the bottom of my functional range, I'm looking at lighter and brighter. I would also recommend that you start with narrow vowels like that, so that you get the most ease of working with the resonances in your voice and focusing on being light and bright. If you try to depress the larynx into it, you're almost certainly going to cut off your range prematurely and also tense up a lot of the soft tissues in the oral cavity, and that's just going to destroy that resonance and not give you the kind of coloration that you could, in fact, achieve by looking for what I call it the least viable sound. So it still sounds like you're singing, it's still connected, the intonation is good, it connects with the rest of your voice. So if you started there, the least viable sound that connects through the remainder of your range, look for that. That will be a good way to work on lowering and getting access to some more of those lower notes more effectively. I have a question about singing harmony. I love these. Now, I'm going to read these two questions back to back, and then I'm going to pick them apart a little bit, because these two are very much related. I suspect in some works, the quartet in Rigoletto, for example, each singer sings his part as best he or she can and is guided by the conductor. In one-on-one harmonies, such as some pop and folk and country, they probably listen to each other and know where they are going, but can focus on blending. However, what about groups of 3 or 4? Peter, Paul, and Mary, or the Manhattan Transfer? Who listens to whom? How do they achieve those beautiful composite sounds from singing their individual parts? And the question related to this is, can't be sure you've not covered it already, and you probably have, but I'd love to know more about learning to sing in harmony and how to learn to improvise harmonies. So, very similar questions. And this is tricky because in some respects it's kind of all of the above and none of that really. Ultimately, harmony parts, now particularly, let's be specific here, in the part in Rigoletto, the quartet in Rigoletto, all of those parts are written out and you can follow along with the sheet music. Ergo, you could also just sing each individual part with no other voices and a metronome and a guide tone. So like, unless you have absolute pitch, in other words, you have perfect pitch and you don't need a reference pitch for anything, then you could set a metronome to the tempo and maybe start and stop it when there's, retardandos and accelerandos and things like that, or adjust it accordingly. But you get my drift here. Not a single one of those parts actually needs to listen to anybody else. And the conductor might be giving the occasional cue, but that's primarily going to be in the pit. They may occasionally signal something to the folks that are on stage, but generally they are keeping time, like in a 4 pattern or a 3 pattern or a 2 pattern, something to that effect. They're keeping the pulse. So if you listen to the quartet from Rigoletto, there is a definitive pulse that is occurring, and each of those parts maps onto that pulse, going along with the rhythmical notation that is taken from the parts as they were written out. Now, sure, you can listen to your fellow vocalists just to make sure that everyone is staying together and things like that, but each individual performer is responsible for keeping track of the time, knowing their parts, and knowing where the notes of those parts fit in time. You know, when you look at an eighth note and it has a bigger squiggle and like a little flag, that's not just kind of later on after the bar line, that's on the and of 2. You know, the bigger squiggle being a quarter rest and the flag with the tiny dot being an eighth rest. That squarely puts that eighth note on the and of 2. There is only one location that can be. So if we are tracking the pulse and we know our part, then we sing along with that pulse. The same is true for groups like Peter, Paul, and Mary. The same is true, really, even in a pop vocal setting, because most of the time, even when you have a tight harmony that's shadowing the lead vocal, there are times when that harmony part might sustain a pitch where the lead is changing pitches or is doing a multisyllabic word and the harmony part is staying on one syllable of a word to catch up later. There are all these minor little changes that make it so that it's much, much better when we as individuals account for the time in the piece. Furthermore, all of these parts are contrapuntal. So, for example, you say here, Manhattan Transfer, how do they achieve those beautiful composite sounds from singing their individual parts? Counterpoint. Counterpoint or contrapuntal harmonies, the practice of harmonization. So those melody lines are choosing selectively chord tones from the underlying chordal structure or passing tones that complement one another so that it all works together. This can be done in advance. Either, in other words, it could all be written out, or it could be done in advance where you are working together as a group, learning those lines, finding notes that work, finding passing tones that work as appropriate, things like that. One might argue that that is, in fact, improvising harmonies, because if you're not writing it down, you're playing the song and harmonizing along with the lead, and you're improvising it as you go, making fixes along the way. You work out the part, and then you can go from there. Obviously, the more that you do this, the better you can become at it, and as much as a song is diatonic, it will make it easier and easier to stay in the right key and be harmonically complementary to the lead vocal line. If there's a lot of like secondary dominance, for example, where like a secondary dominant would be, let's say we're in the key of C. Okay? A secondary dominant, okay, so first of all, right, 1, 5, 6, 4, very, very common chord change. You know, so many songs are just like that. But let's just say we want to juice this up a little bit. We come here. So here we have a secondary dominant in first inversion. There's the 1 chord, there's the 5 chord, and then I played an E major chord in first inversion. So I have a G sharp in the bass, but you have G sharp, B, and E here. This is the 5 of 6, A minor. Now, if we stayed diatonic, it doesn't sound like all that much in first inversion. You'd probably have to go to root position. Yeah, and that's kind of cool too. But you can see how the secondary dominant really drives you towards A minor. It really gives you a lot of velocity moving towards that 6 chord. When you get more chords like that, harmonization becomes more challenging. Being able to improvise it becomes more challenging too. Knowing the chords and knowing the lead melody can really, really help you improvise these parts. Let me just quickly make sure I've not missed anything here. I mean, that's basically it. We're all responsible for the pulse. We're all responsible to know our parts and stay in time. Yes, we can reference the conductor, but we still have to internalize that pulse and count along with it. I nearly forgot Gilda. So Gilda is a soprano part in the Rigoletto. There are also cues from the music. So if you listen as the quartet progresses, and especially as you get near the end, if you listen to Gilda and the violins, you can hear that the violins are playing her part. I couldn't quite hear in the recording I referenced whether or not like any of the bass instruments were comping any of the parts from Rigoletto. If you could hear like any kind of parts happening in the orchestra part. But in those pieces too, there will occasionally be cues in the orchestra that a vocalist can reference in order to kind of double check themselves, use it as a cue. But it's a cue, it's not the, shall we say, end all be all of reliance, because it won't always be there. We have to internalize the pulse, we have to know our parts, we have to be able to count these things, to be able to accurately execute the rhythms. So it is a little bit of everything, but also I think different in that there's a lot more, in my opinion, there's a lot more personal responsibility to know one's part and accurately adhere to the beat. And as for singing in harmony and improvised harmonies, I've covered a lot of that in the previous answer. I will also say this too, that I can't emphasize enough, knowing the lead vocal line will help immensely. I mean, not the least of reasons would be because if you don't know the notes that they're about to sing, how do you know what note's going to be a harmony part and what's going to be a unison? It's particularly beneficial to know that lead line. Knowing the underlying chord structures can also be very, very helpful too. As a general kind of practice for it, if you just went to your major scales, E, and kind of got accustomed to singing thirds above the notes of your scale, E, 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 that can help a lot in just kind of getting a flavor for the distance of a third, to get your ear and your sense of aural skills trained so that you can find those thirds more easily and then sing along with the lead vocal line. How much air and volume is too... Oops, sorry. Hi Jeff, what is the safest way to unlock the whistle register and maintain the same? This comes up very frequently, and I'm so sorry, it is really not my specialty, and I'm afraid that I'm not the person to ask that question, and quite frankly, I'm not even sure who would be, because so much of what happens with whistle register is kind of unknown. When you're using that range of your voice, the epiglottis closes over the top of the vocal fold. And so as far as I'm aware, you cannot in fact get a scope down there to directly observe what is occurring. The best explanations for it is that the epiglottis in fact forms an aperture when it closes, and that is actually producing the pitch more so than the actual vocal folds themselves. I have experimented with it, but have been unsatisfied with the sensations, the feeling, and also I don't ever want to compromise what's happening at my secondo passaggio. That is far more important to me as a vocalist, as a singer, and someone who makes music too, in addition to doing these tutorials. And so I have not really pursued it. I would highly recommend you, if that is necessary for your artistic pursuits, I'm afraid you're gonna have to look elsewhere. How much air and volume is too much in higher ranges? I find when I do a hollow sound with a lot of air, I can belt shout up to A4 when trying to exercise my voice. I'm scared it might hurt though. Yeah, and I think that that is a reasonable expectation that I mean, don't be scared about it. Maybe just don't do it. Maybe find a different way. It's hard to say exactly what you are doing. You're talking about a hollow voice, which might be right. You might be allowing the vocal fold to elongate. So in fact, you are using your cricothyroid dominant singing voice, but it's really hard to know. Because you've used the word belt and shout, my suspicions is that you're not. So there's a couple things that are happening in this practice that you have here. One, you could in fact be, causing undue strain on your voice, which won't immediately have an impact, but may catch up with you in the long run, and particularly if that's the only way that you can sing those pitches. It will probably catch up with you over a period of time. Even more, I mean, that's of a concern, but even a greater concern in the bigger picture of your progress as a vocalist is that by forcing your voice to do that, you are obscuring the most efficient point of transition. Very frequently, I get comments that go something to the effect of, once I get to A4, anything above that just becomes airy and uncontrollable and I can't do it, but that's where my break is. Well, probably not. That's the point where you can no longer keep the vocal fold adducted with the sheer force of your voice. And so then it just separates and gets into this like airy falsetto type of tone production. The vast majority, and since you've said A4, I am making the assumption that you're like a tenor or baritone vocalist. Forgive me if that's incorrect. The vast majority of tenors and baritones are going to have their best transition points, their secondo passagios, somewhere between like here and here. So if your secondo passaggio is here, you're a tenor. If it's here, you're a tenor. If it's here, you're a baritone, a semitone. Oftentimes these folks get classified as baritenors. If it's here, you're a baritone. Mine is kind of leaning towards the F sharp, but it's not F, but it's not quite F sharp. It might not be specifically on a key on the piano. We're not built to Western tonal music standards. We are built to our own standards. So that most efficient point of transition might be somewhere in between the keys. That's fine too. We learn to work with it. We also learn if we give that some consideration and we work towards balance in our voice, then when we come back to here, we can sing beyond that point so that no casual listener is going to realize there's a transition there. Remember, right in between those two pitches is where my registration event, my secondo passaggio is. And I think I sang up to B5 there. I was kind of loosely tracking the piano while I was playing it. The point here is that if we're forcing our voices, we are covering up where transitions and tendencies lie. We're using brute force and muscle tension to obscure those points. And we will learn more about our voice and gain more functionality by backing off a little bit, experiencing the registration events, working with them to practice, and then master them and go on from there. And then later on, you can choose to belt if you want, knowing that there are certain limits where you can do so without issue for any period of time. Generally speaking, as long as you're not exceeding a major second above your known secondo passaggio, it's probably going to be fine. You probably won't have any undue fatigue to deal with. But if your voice is a bit more on the delicate side or just doesn't respond well to that, that may be something that you have to consider in your performances moving forward and how you allocate the percentage of times when you belt versus when you might use voce piena in testa, the sound of chest voice in head. Great questions. This might be an age thing, still 17. But sometimes parts of my range just don't work as well some days. Working on head voice the next day, my lower chest is a little more absent, less resonant, vice versa. My head voice can be extra hooty on very chesty days. Is this my voice as imbalanced, or is this growth changes voice changing? It could be a bit of all of those, actually. At the age of 17, if you are male and you've had your voice change, then it's still probably settling down. When you talk about like on the days where you're working on your chest voice, the head voice is very hooty, and then vice versa, that sort of suggests a kind of balancing act, that things aren't really as balanced as they could be. But at 17, you've got a lot of time to work towards developing and fine-tuning that balance. I mean, in the classical world, a male vocalist won't really be fully developed until their 30s. Mezzos and sopranos and stuff like that a bit earlier, baritones and basses even later still. So you've got some time, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't still work on balancing those things out. I'm a very big fan of this exercise. Short note, short breath, short note, short breath. Those short notes followed by the breath that resets the adduction of the vocal fold really helps towards balancing things out. You can move up and down the keys that way, see how it works out, see if it doesn't help you get more balance overall with your vocal delivery. Thanks for all the vocal lessons for baritones. You are most welcome, and I owe the baritone clan a bass baritone bass range workout, which I will do. Dear Jeff, my vibrato is getting too big. Is this a side effect from getting older? Is there an exercise to reduce it? Hard to say. I don't know how old you are, and I also don't know more about what's happening with you vocally. My concern is that there is some type of attenuation with the airflow, and you haven't said this, so I'm kind of going off on my own little limb here. But if there's an element of choppiness to it or a herky-jerkiness to it of anything like that, that could be an indication that you're disengaging a little bit too much with the air column, and that's resulting in the width and the kind of jerkiness of it. If it's staying really, really well connected, it could kind of be just an indication of really good flexibility and release of the vocal mechanism. But if it's undesirable, you may want to work towards curtailing it a little bit. I would investigate my engagement first and foremost. I'm reluctant to suggest any kind of straight tone exercises because those are, by definition, somewhat more taxing on the vocal mechanism. But that would be something that you could consider, is try singing with a bit of straight tone, noticing what is required, which mostly will feel like a sort of more engagement around the vocal mechanism, more tension. Again, this, use that as a practice if and only if I'm wrong about the herky-jerkiness or the choppiness in the vibrato. That's almost certainly an airflow thing. Notice the difference in physical sensations between when you're singing with your vibrato and versus the straight tone, and see if you can find a happy medium between the two and see the effect that has on the vibrato. But again, singing with straight tone is inherently more vocal fold engagement in that practice, and so tiny amounts of that in very short, very, very comfortable areas of your voice, short period, and then come back to your normal vocalizations. And compare and contrast the physical sensations that you're experiencing. How are you doing? What if you only have a few seconds and somebody asks you to sing? What exercise could you do to accommodate your voice? I've saw that a few times ago. I don't remember. Thank you, Jeff. Well, one, if that happened, I would just sing a song that I knew I could knock out of the park without any issue. like with no issues whatsoever, without having to warm up. I would just do that. And then beyond that, if they said, well, I want you to sing this, and I knew that that was particularly challenging for me, or I didn't know the song very well or at all, or I wasn't feeling my best, I might politely decline, quite frankly, because I never want to sing and not put my best foot forward. But if I'm given a few seconds to warm up, then I'm going to probably do the exercise I showed you a moment ago. A few rounds of to really get my body. I mean, like I'm hot. Like just in that much of it, I'm almost breaking a sweat. I'm using so much energy. And what that's doing is just getting my body absolutely awake and prepped to sing. I'm going to pick a song that I know is easy for me, and I'm going to do the absolute best that I can. But mostly, I'm going to work towards avoiding those kinds of situations or being prepared so that I know if that's a possibility, I'm ready to go. That being said, it does happen, and it's kind of fun to just sing a song every once in a while. So I don't think of it as a bad thing necessarily, just as something that is still up to me to decide. And I think you should feel the same way. It is up to you to decide. How can I help my singing voice at the end of a long teaching day? Probably sit quietly and rest. Water, room temperature water, rest. Also, too, it's worth considering what you do during your teaching day. Now, you haven't said that you're a vocal instructor, but we could look at that one of two ways. If you're a vocal instructor, then do your best to minimize the amount of speaking time. Make sure that you're staying engaged while you're doing so. I'm doing that right now while I'm talking to you, trying to avoid using too much vocal fold tension in order to produce my speaking voice. Try not to talk too loudly, but don't also whisper. Whispering is not necessarily that good for you either. But rest. Rest is really, really, really important. I try to rest very much so at the end of the night before I go to sleep to give my voice some time to recover. If you're just a teacher in general and you're wanting to allow your voice to recuperate for your singing afterwards as like your passion or hobby or something to that effect, the same thing really still applies, but even more so, guard your voice during the day. Stay hydrated, as challenging as that might be if you're a classroom teacher. And speak at a normal volume. Try to stay engaged while you are speaking to reduce as much wear and tear on your voice as you possibly can. But hydration will figure prominently in that. How can one activate the breath to be singing ready, non-shaky and breathy, when one has to sing at short notice? I kind of addressed this in the previous question. That RPTK, that's a really, really good exercise. I'll just do it again. And I'm using so much air, I'm breathing in between just about every one of the utterances that I'm doing in the exercise. That's a really, really great exercise. And normally I would do like 2 or 3 laps on that whole sequence. And you will get super, super hot in getting ready for that. That's a pretty good way to get it going. Lip trill is nice too. Last question. I'm a baritone. My question is, can I become a tenor or a baritenor? No, is the short answer. We get what we get. So what you are equipped with right now is what you've got. However, you can emulate if you are in fact. Okay, so maybe I'm a little bit hasty here. But you can't fundamentally change your FOC. It is the structure of the system. If you're a baritone, you can emulate the tone qualities of a tenor to a large degree and cover about 90-95% of the overall range that a tenor would cover. You will have tendencies in the usage of your voice that you will have to work around, like the weightiness down low and things like that. Those, you will have to sing those in a capacity that feels somewhat lighter and smaller than what you might naturally be given to do. If you are singing classical repertoire, and this is doable to sort of masquerade as a tenor if you're a baritone, the secondo passaggio will not be your personal secondo passaggio may be at very disadvantageous places in the repertoire, which means your technique has to be even that much more solid in order to sing that repertoire. But you can emulate a lot of the tone qualities and cover 90-95% of the range that the tenor would be able to do. So in all but the most of extreme cases, you would in fact be able to do that. The baritenor is interesting because at some point, if between your practice and your coach, there's no clear delineation of like the secondo passaggio should really be at F, it should really be at E. Like that semitone right there is the difference between tenor robusto and lyric baritone. You just cannot come up with an answer, then ultimately you can kind of choose. And the same things that I mentioned about a baritone masquerading as a tenor apply. You train and practice the resonances, the tone qualities, the responses, the way that a tenor would, and move forth in that capacity. So you cannot fundamentally change the mechanism, barring like hormone treatments will cause changes, going from a smaller instrument to a larger one. It'll cause a thickening of the vocal folds. So you can do things like that, but aside from that sort of stuff, you are given what you are given, and I would encourage you to explore it, understand it, worry less about your vocal range designation or FOC, and focus more on how to make the best usage of it and how to use it so that you can sing the repertoire or songs that you wish to sing. Work with what you have rather than wondering or worrying about or wishing that you had something else. Because what you have is your very own. There will never be another like it. And I, for one, and I would suggest I hope I speak for others too in this, that I want to hear you, not a facsimile of someone else. You and your voice and what you have to offer us. So thank you so much for all these wonderful questions. So much fun. Take really good care of your voices. Do subscribe if you're still with me. I would really appreciate it. And remember that if you want MP3s of the warm-up videos and this, head on over to Patreon and be a subscriber and support the work that we're doing here. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. My name is Jeff. Take really good care of your voices. Enjoy singing, and hopefully we'll see you again. Bye.